Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for this panel discussion with educational leaders from Corwin and NWEA. Before we get started, let's go over a few logistics. During today's discussion, all attendees will be in listen-only mode. We encourage to please submit questions for our speakers through the chat box. We'll answer as many as we can, both in the chat window and during our question and answer session at the end of our presentation. This webinar is being recorded. You'll receive a recording and a PDF of the presentation within a day via email. As a reminder, a certification of attendance will be sent via email after the event. As I'm lucky enough, I get to introduce myself today. My name is Dominique Smith. I am a principal here in San Diego, California, and I love my focus around restorative practices, school equity, and collective teacher advocacy. I've been lucky enough to partner with everybody on this call today, and I'm hoping you'll be excited to learn from all of us. I see everybody opening up our chat. Thank you so much for being here. Are my students learning? It's a question we're committed to helping educators answer. As our students continue to learn in a remote environment, Corwin and NWEA are proud to partner and share with education leaders new ways to support academic growth. We're excited to host this panel discussion on the administrator's role in leading instruction and assessment during distance learning. During this panel discussion, our group of experts will discuss specific tools and strategies administrators need to identify unfinished learning while promoting student growth and equity. It is my honor to introduce everybody today. Our panelists, Douglas Fisher and Nancy Frey, are professors of educational leadership at San Diego State University and leaders at Health Sciences High and Middle College. They have published numerous articles on reading and literacy, differentiated instruction, and curriculum design, as well as books such as PLC Plus, Better Decisions and Greater Impact by Design, and Assessment Capable Visible Learners, as well as a distance learning series. John Hattie is a researcher and author with nearly 30 years of experience examining what works best in student learning and achievement. His research, better known as visible learning, is accumulation of nearly 30 years, synthesizing more than 1,600 meta-analyses, comprising more than 90,000 studies involving 1/3 billion students around the world. Chase Nordengren is a program evaluator and researcher at NWEA, where he focuses on understanding the impact of professional learning on teachers and students. His work includes mixed methods, data gathering and analysis, collaboration with partners on evaluation design, a needs assessment, and internal focus on supporting continuous improvement process. His past work has addressed social emotional learning, the instructional uses of assessment, and mixed methods validation procedures, among other subjects. He received a PhD in leadership policy and organizations in the K-12 systems at the University of Washington in 2015. In addition, Chase was the lead author on a paper, Turning a New Page, Guiding Instruction and Using Map Growth Amid COVID-19 School Closures, which serves as a foundation of many of the strategies he'll be discussing today. Chase, Doug, Nancy, and John, thank you for joining us today. So let's get into our first question. How have closures of spring and the proliferation of distance learning this fall impacted what teachers know about what their students are ready to learn? John, could you take us away?
Sure. Like I live in Melbourne, Australia, and we've just come out last week of 4 months of close down of schools. And unlike your country, we started COVID at the start of our school year. So we've had about 7 months of experience. And so a lot of work's coming in about the answers to that question. And of course, there are some negatives, unemployment, sickness, death, but I want to emphasize the opposite. There have been some unbelievably stunning ways in which teachers, school leaders have so quickly adapted to the new way of running instruction online at home. And certainly teachers have come to understand their students in different ways, because through social media, many students are much more willing to talk about what they don't know than they are in the regular classroom. It's absolutely become necessary that teachers focus on how you teach self-regulation and give the students more stepping stones in their work. It's not just, you can't just come up with a task for them to do, give it to them and hover over them while they do it, which we can in the regular class. So we've had to worry about self-regulation. We've had to worry about them as learners, and we've got to know them in terms of good discovery and diagnosis in much more powerful ways. And certainly one of the messages that we want to bring along today is how we as teachers and educators during this COVID teaching keep a learning log of what is the good things, are the good things that are happening on this. Now, I'm not going to portray everything's rosy, but I certainly want to say that with the many studies that are now coming through after 8 months, there are some opportunities. In reading and reading and mathematics, the performances for many students has actually gone up. For writing, it's gone down quite a lot because online we've forgotten that writing is still a pretty important part of the equation. So I see this as an incredible opportunity to trial out new ways of interacting with your students, teaching the students to be less dependent on us. And it's those students that are most dependent on us, the ones that suffer the most during COVID time. So I think there's opportunities here, Dominic.
Thank you. Chase, would you like to add on to that?
Yeah, happy to. And hello, everyone. I think it would be easy to answer this question if we could point to a day on the calendar and say, this is the day that COVID is over and school gets back to normal. As we know, this period is ongoing, and I think it will be ongoing, at least in some ways, until the virus is eradicated. We've taken at NWEA to calling this period interrupted learning as a way of describing learning that occurs at irregular intervals and breaks routines in meeting the needs of learners, like their academic needs, their social needs, their emotional needs, their technological and their physical needs. And so hopefully you see from that even when students come back into schools, there are certain aspects of schools they may be missing. We're meant to encompass in that not just the amount of time that's been lost to instruction, but the losses of things like ready interaction with peers, some of the technology disparities that we have between students now that are limiting their ability to access virtual instruction, access to extracurricular activities, which may be limited for a long time to come. And of course, a lot of the economic hardships of the pandemic that are seeing instances of poverty and student and familial hardship that are largely unprecedented. I think every district, every state, every country will experience this differently. But wanted to raise two observations that I've gathered from conversations with our partners. One big impact as it relates to assessment is that assessments in the spring were interrupted or they were postponed. Teachers lost from that a lot of their sense of closure about how last year went. It also disrupted a lot of teacher collaboration in the summer and the fall about how students transition to the next grade, what they're ready to learn in the next grade. The second, which has frankly surprised me a little bit, is that this fall, class composition has been really unstable and shifting. Here in the US, while we had a lot of districts where some students started in person, some students were remote, and some students were hybrid, many districts are now allowing students to switch modes, or districts are finding that students who were taught in person are now having to leave class to go to quarantine and come back. This becomes an important barrier to think about as you think about an ongoing line of formative assessment information, right? Teachers who are trying to understand a student's learning over time now have a certain number of challenges as students switch modes, potentially switch teachers, and as the instructional environment that students experience from week to week becomes a lot less predictable.
Thank you. And just a reminder for anybody on the right top corner, if you want to put side-by-side view, we'll leave our question up and you can make sure that you are hearing our experts today. So our next question, what role does assessment play in understanding the needs of each student? How has this changed in a remote learning environment? Doug, can you take it away?
Sure. So assessment plays an important role. It helps us determine our impact. Did students actually learn things? Part of our role is to document student learning, to monitor the progress that our students make, share data with them, talk with them about data so they can own that data, where they're learning to monitor their own progress and they're learning to assess themselves. That didn't change. Assessment helps us think about the impact and the process. It's changed in remote learning by and large, because what we heard 3-4 weeks into graded education again, because in the spring in the US, most school systems did not have graded education. They said, hold harmless, your grades are going to be fine. When we started seeing graded school, the most common thing we heard was they're all cheating. Everybody's cheating again, and because they can. And if you create assessments for which Mrs. Google can answer, great. Kids are going to go ask her to answer. The other thing is we're seeing significant overhelping of families. Parents whispering answers, doing tests again. We're seeing all these Twitter feeds of parents getting caught cheating on the test, helping their kids, because we haven't helped parents understand the role that assessment plays in informing the teacher. My thinking on this, John, Nancy, and I have been talking a lot about assessment. We have to get past this dichotomy of a formative and a summative assessment. Assessments can be used to guide instruction, and we should be thinking of ourselves as evaluators of our impact. How can we find really good data, information that we can use to evaluate? So we've been talking about things like universal responses, having kids have a universal response opportunity like a waterfall chat, or old school holding up dry erase boards. Teach back has become a big part of how we assess, asking kids to teach back to their families, to their peers. We're seeing a lot more self-assessment than I think we've ever seen. Students learning how to self-assess, and then their teachers looking at this to say, did my students learn it? I can validate with this, or do I still need to have them grow some more?
Thank you. And Chase, could you add on to that?
Yeah, and I couldn't agree with Doug more, especially in all of those call outs to the various ways in which formative assessment is really informative right now. I think uncertainty is in many ways the watchword of this time, and particularly when it comes to that instructional planning piece, right? What does it mean to be in 4th grade if you as a student never really finished 3rd grade? There's so much content to cover for those students and even less time to do it in, that it becomes really important to find ways to figure out, what do you emphasize? What standards and content gaps are really essential to fill in for every student? What's the shortest path for the student from where they are to academic proficiency? And that's where doing high quality formative assessment can really be your guide. I think in addition to that, another benefit from doing formative work is helping to re-engage students at a moment when engagement couldn't be even more critical. Every student's now learning at their own pace, they're learning in their own ways, and we can't really count on students to stay at similar learning levels to each other. And so it becomes important to find ways to promote what we call student ownership of learning. Find ways to release responsibility over time back to students for ideas like seeking feedback, correcting misconceptions in their work, building knowledge. I think with so much unpredictable about this year, formative assessment really helps your instructional strategies remain flexible so that you can adjust as the world changes.
Perfect. And Doug, just for clarification, can you define a little bit more what are waterfall chats?
Sure. So what we typically do, what we're seeing now is called live chat. It's just going as it goes. And we've been experimenting with saying to students, okay, thinking time, processing time, type your response in, don't hit return, don't let anybody see it. And then on the count of 3 or whatever signal you use, waterfall is what we use, and it just lets the chat go. I type the word start and I hit waterfall, say waterfall. And at the end I say stop. So it marks my chat. So when I download the chat, I can see the block of responses between that time. It's just one universal response opportunity we have to invite students to share with us what they were thinking at that time.
And then really quickly, if any of you would like to pop onto this, so what are some examples of protocols and routines for student self-assessment in distance learning and or hybrid learning mode?
I think a key thing at this stage, Dominic, is to absolutely make sure that not only do the students know what success looks like in terms of the success criteria, perhaps looking at more steps than that in terms of this is the content that we're going to work on, this is the depth. And I think the big message here is that online teaching is a wonderful opportunity to cover less and go deeper. Mm-hmm. What an opportunity.
Yeah, and
Thank
in
you.
terms of specific techniques, I'd encourage folks to look at NWEA's blog, Teach, Learn, Grow. We've published a number of posts and an ebook recently about various formative techniques. But to Doug's point about holding whiteboards up to a camera, I don't think this needs to be overly complicated, right? There are ways to adapt the formative assessment techniques that we've always used to a virtual environment using a minimum of complex tools.
So you remember the old DVD CD cases? This one has green paper and red paper inside, so students can hold it up and tell their teacher. We do see a lot of students who don't want to be on the camera, but they will hold up their responses so their teachers can see. I say we're teaching a lot to ceiling fans and get a little dizzy from all the different speeds of the ceiling fans, but they'll show us what they're thinking.
That's excellent. Thank you. Our following question. Why is goal setting and defining outcomes with students more important than ever? And how can leaders most effectively support this process for our teachers? And Chase, we're hoping you could take this one on first.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a topic that's really close to my heart. So when we talk about student goal setting, what we're talking about is the process by which teachers work with students to set meaningful and realistic targets for learning and ensure that students, even in this period of hardship, really believe in their own ability to meet those goals. John's work has shown over the years that providing students with appropriately challenging goals and giving them opportunities for deliberate practice toward mastery is really a linchpin strategy of effective teaching, has huge impacts on student outcomes. I think engaging students in that process and the process of setting and monitoring their own goals is another really essential ingredient in that mixture. And it travels hand in hand with formative assessment, right? Once you've done some of these formative assessment techniques, goal setting can be the next action step. Empowering students to reflect back on the data from the assessment to decide what they're going to learn next, and to work with you to pick steps to decide how to get there. One of the reasons why it's really important right now is that I think the same kinds of oversights that we're used to having over students just aren't possible in the same way. If a student's receiving an hour or two of instruction by a video, the rest of the day is really up to them. They're in charge of deciding how they're going to learn, when they're going to learn, or whether they'll learn at all. And so that's one of the reasons why coming back to student ownership of learning is such an important theme in this time, making sure that students have that buy-in, know what they're after. There are lots of tips and strategies for how to do goal setting well on our blog and in other places, but I think the single most important thing that leaders can ask teachers to do is make sure they're checking in. If you as a teacher are having conversations with individual students about what they're learning, what their formative assessments have found, and what they should be ready to learn next, and you're having those conversations every 1 to 2 weeks, I think you're 75% of the way toward a great goal setting practice that is really going to see some of those impacts that John has documented.
And
I think
Nancy,
there's a new word we're going to learn. Sorry, Nancy, where you go?
Oh, no, please continue, John.
I think there's a new word that we're certainly learning during this COVID teaching. Like students are told all the time they have to be effective, they have to get good grades or whatever. The new word is efficient. And as you were saying, Chase, that many of the students are starting to say, I can do what I do at school in 6 hours, at home in 2 hours. And I think this is an incredible opportunity to use that notion of efficiency to also value the nature of what kids are doing. They don't have to do all the time. And certainly one of the things, as you were saying, is getting the students to take more responsibility for their assessment. Perhaps this is the time to introduce the notion of personal bests and get the students to try and understand what their current performance is and then get better than that, which is kind of the same notion as a success criteria. But certainly this is the chance to spend more time getting the students involved, which is an incredibly desirable thing we should do.
And, you know, John, I appreciate so much your point about raising what goal setting actually looks like. As Chase had noted, it's incumbent on us as teachers to help students set goals in addition to giving them goals, to providing them goals. We need them to be a part of this conversation. And if we're going to make goal setting assessment as learning, in other words, that students are learning about themselves as they set goals, as they obtain their personal best and so on, then teachers need to be able to create those opportunities for students to do exactly that. That means lots more self-assessment opportunities. And quite frankly, that means that it's also a shift for us and a learning for us as educators, that we're paying close attention to the assets that our students bring to the classroom, rather than only confine assessment and view it very narrowly from a deficit thinking kind of practice. But Dominique, I'd like to take on the second part of that question about leaders supporting teachers in being able to do this. And safe practice is an essential part of this. If we want teachers to be engaging in newer or perhaps less familiar practices, such as self-assessment and helping students to set their own goals, then we need to give them safe practice in order to do so. You know, we talk so much about the importance of developing a culture of error for our students, that they understand that part of learning is in those partially successful attempts. We also have to do so for the teachers that we work with. We have to make it okay that there is a culture of error in engaging in these new practices, to be able to free up people from the worry or the hesitancy that they have about trying something new and unfamiliar for fear that they'll be judged. And so as leaders, I think it's essential to build that environment so that it's really conducive for adult learning, in the same way that we attempt to build the environment so that it's conducive for student learning.
And Nancy, I couldn't agree with you more. I think right now our teachers are so nervous. It's brand new. What am I doing? Am I going to fail? And it went back to that first time you went to a classroom and said, I don't want to fail. I want to be great. I want to make sure everything's perfect. And right now, I think the celebration of thank you for trying and try it again, and let's have feedback and try together, it builds that collective as a team. And now I know you're here with me on this journey. It's not a us versus them. You're here, you're protecting me, you're working with me, and that's gonna, expand us a little bit more as a team. And so one of the questions that kind of came up was, how do we make collective teacher efficacy visible at the school site right now? And I was hoping maybe you could dive into that question really quickly.
I think a major aspect of that, and something that leaders can do, is really take on that stance that my role, that a chief role, is to be able to amplify and magnify innovative practices. So for example, in professional learning events, making sure that there are times that are planned in advance to be able to spotlight those innovative practices that are happening right there on campus, so that teachers can see their fellow teachers engaging in these newer practices. They can talk with one another. How did you do that? What's your advice? And so on. I think as leaders right now, especially, we're amplifiers, we're magnifiers of those innovative practices.
Of those effective practices.
That's true.
Effective practices. They have to work if we want to magnify them. And as you were talking, Nancy, I was flashing back a couple things on my mind around assessment and data. There is the narrative in this country, at least, and perhaps around the world, of the learning loss. And we need to use assessment to document the learning loss so that we can set goals for students. And I worry about this discussion because if we keep talking about learning losses and gaps and remediation, we set up a deficit mindset and we might grant ourselves permission to lower our expectations. So that's on my mind a lot. I hear so many people saying, I'm a first year teacher again. And I would really like to interrupt that. You're not a first year, unless you literally are a first year teacher, you're not a first year teacher. You still have knowledge that you bring to bear in this profession. You didn't forget how to be a teacher. You didn't forget the way to design learning. Maybe you need some tools to access, but your students, whether it's distant, remote, blended, simultaneous, hybrid, high flex, whatever it is, but you didn't forget how to be a teacher. And when we keep saying that, we diminish our sense of self. And then when John said a new word, I flashed back to a new word you recently taught me, ipsative, which I didn't know anything about. And so while we're talking on assessment, I thought maybe you and John could talk about ipsative assessment.
I love that. So, and I am definitely want to hear what John's thoughts are about this too, because John, I know that your work is deeply embedded in this. Ipsative assessment, which is not necessarily a common term, but is certainly well recognized, is those self-assessments, especially as students get to compare what it is that they did earlier with what it is that they did now. And there's great power in being able to have those conversations, in being able to help students notice their own learning happening in real time.
But certainly if you look at the whole concept of feedback, the most powerful notion there is giving students information about where they need to go next. And part of the beauty of thinking of it from an ipsative point of view is you want the students to also be party to that process of them making decisions about where to next. Of course, you are there to make sure they don't go down blind alleys. But so much time in the regular class, the students are waiting for you to tell them where to go next and what to do next. Online, they're going to have to make some of those decisions. And surely that's the essence of self-regulation and self-monitoring. And so giving them chances. Now, remember, your job is to make sure they don't go down blind alleys. It's not just giving them complete and utter control over this. But this notion of getting the students to compare themselves to what they could do before, as opposed to in the regular classroom where they usually compare themselves to other students and they constantly hear about, oh, this student's done well or that student's not done well. So they see it as a kind of peer-to-peer competition. But ipsative is individual notions. And one of the nice things about the internet is the students, for good and bad, are very used to using social media to talk to their friends about what there's on their mind. Now, obviously, there's some downsides to that, but the good side is they're much more prepared to talk to you over the internet about how they're thinking, what they're struggling with, and as many of you said in the chat, legitimizing error, legitimizing not know. Like they didn't come to your class to learn that which they already know. So here's a wonderful opportunity to legitimize the notion that not knowing, failure is the learner's best friend. And as long as it's that you include that ipsative. I'm not saying you shouldn't do the other forms of assessment in comparison, etc., in comparison to whatever, but this is an incredible opportunity to make it much more abound, the confidence that students have and the skills they have to get from one step to the next.
So let me link a couple of those ideas back to one of the things that Doug was saying about goal setting and the trap that comes from we need to do assessments so that we can set goals for kids. I think the paradigm that we're talking about here is really about, no, we don't set the goals for kids. The kid sets the goal. And our job in that process is providing them the information, the supports, the encouragement they need to do that without wandering down those blind alleys. And I think if you go about it that way and think about ways that you can continue to put that responsibility back on students, you hopefully create an environment where, John, to your point, students aren't comparing themselves to each other, they're comparing themselves to what they've done in the past. And that works now in virtual instruction and hopefully reflects a little bit once they actually do get back to the classroom.
As I have another formal question coming up, but I've been seeing some really great questions within our chats. I'm going to shoot one out to you guys really quickly. What are some strategies that teachers may use for assessment when the majority of students do not have access to internet? And then the statement says, we are mainly using packets and airdropping material into student devices, which limits the in real-time interaction.
And this is a huge challenge that we hear, especially in remote areas that have limited access to the internet. Hearing some people do what we call confirmatory assessment, where they interview a kid, even if there's a cell phone connection, they can do a one-on-one interview with students for that. We are also seeing students doing retells on video putting it on a flash drive and turning it in. So there's not perfect, and you see, you can use the old mail. It opens up some who's doing the assessment work challenges. So retellings, teachbacks, those kinds of things seem to help with authenticity of the students actually producing the assessment information.
Thank you. And as we move forward, our next question for our experts are, how are leaders approaching high quality instruction and providing opportunities for improvement? And I was hoping, John, you could take this one on first.
I think the first thing is that the nature of teaching, before I come to the leaders, is going to change, because in the regular classroom, it's dominated by us talking and we're in control. When you go to COVID-related teaching, the new concept is going to be triage, like nurses do when they see a patient for the first time, working out very quickly what the priorities are, listening to the patient to understand what it is that's going on, et cetera, et cetera. And so we're going to find a lot more triage and less talking. In the staff room, same kind of notion. The leaders are going to have to worry, like you do when you get on an aeroplane, putting the oxygen mask on the teachers and making sure that you understand what's important for them right now, and more time listening to what they're doing. You're going to find this notion of collaborative impact so much more powerful, where you get teachers to bring along problems, which, as I'm sure we know, everyone has. But there's going to be much more opportunity in the staff room to share those and not see your ego as, oh, because I'm an experienced teacher, I don't have problems, only the new ones do. So making that an opportunity to share problems, to share students, to share ideas. And of course, as some of you learned for the first time, amazingly new technologies, how do you get your fellow teachers involved in the teaching of this? So I think that school leaders are going to go back to what I think their true role is. Their role is to help the teachers do their job and not necessarily directly work with the students, and see the teachers in a sense a step between them and the students. Yes, as some of you commented in the chat, it's an opportunity to school leaders to see teaching through the internet and maybe involved in many ways. But your fundamental role is much more about working with the teachers, helping them look at what's happening in the classrooms, diagnosing where students are getting barriers and problems, and attending to those things. And it really is going back to our fundamental role. How do we work together with our teachers so that they can have a better impact?
And if Doug, if you could expand some more on that as well, please.
Sure. So I want to be careful with this question. I think there's a relationship between instruction and learning. And I think one of the mind frames John and Ray put out for leaders is that I have the language of learning. I focus on the language of learning. I don't have the exact mind frame right, but it's about focusing on the language of learning. And so what I want to talk about with teachers is, did this experience, lesson, instruction impact the students' learning? How do you know? So when we have conversations, I'm interested in, did this work? Did this accomplish what you thought it was going to accomplish? How is the lesson you taught different from the one you planned? Did it work out? I mean, those are the kinds of questions that I think we get to. Over time, I think it's okay to have some look fors. In general, we're looking for this. In general, we're looking for this because these things seem to impact learners. I think the newer conversation we're having is, how do you make decisions on what to put synchronous versus asynchronous? And I think that's a newer conversation that very few leaders have had with teachers in the past. The reality is the vast majority of teachers who are leading schools never taught from a distance. And so recognizing that and being open to listening to the experiences of teachers, having not done that job, I think is really important. And then reaching some agreements and helping people say, that seems to really work for asynchronous. That seems to work for synchronous. If you're doing simultaneous learning where some kids are physically in school and some kids are streaming live in, what seems to work? How do you manage that environment? Every teacher we've interviewed on simultaneous learning says it's double the work. You're running 2 classrooms simultaneously. And so I think those are some of the powerful conversations, but I just feel the need to turn this back to you because you are a leader of a school. And how do you frame this with the teachers that you support?
Well, when framing it to our teachers, I think the one thing that we have to continue to say is you're creating something special for kids. And I think that's the one thing that is sometimes lost, sometimes not there. I think we have to celebrate what we know and what can we build for our students. And the chat has been asking, what does distance learning look like? How do we support the teachers? How do we support instruction? I want to make sure it's still spotlighted of success. I still want to make sure that when you look at your students and you're working through certain variables within this, you don't fade away from what you know. You go back to the strategies of success and you work with your students and you work with yourself to say, this is what we will do today and this is how we will be successful. I love that John brought up earlier, when we talk about success criteria with our students, right now is the best time for them, because as our students are trying to figure out how do I become great and how do I make sure I'm successful today, our parents that are sitting right around the corner from the computer are trying to figure out how they can be successful as well. And I think that's a huge component to make sure that is delivered every day at a high level for all family students to be just feeling successful. And as you kind of bring that up, Doug, and to all of you right now, we've seen the chat blowing up. We've seen the questions. We know everybody's in different stages of where we are. What advice do you have for school leaders trying just to make it and manage all of it? So what's that best piece of advice you have for them? And if John, if you could start our conversation with that.
Sure. I think carrying on from what we were saying before, we often talk about school leaders creating their staff rooms in an open to learn situation. Wow, we've never been in a situation where all of us need to be open to learn. So this is a genuine opportunity for school leaders to demonstrate that they are open to learn too. What a powerful notion. There are no individual heroes in this game. And certainly we want school leaders to win the respect, not the praise, of their teachers, to be part of the solution as we go through these next few months, listening to teachers, making sure parents are channeled through the front office more than going directly to the teachers. Like, we won't allow here parents to contact the teachers directly online. They have to do it either through the front office or they have to do it by talking to their students and their kids, and their kids relaying to the teachers. I think there are some routines that school leaders need to set up. Probably the most powerful for school leaders at this stage is to have the most amazing communication you've ever had with your teachers and your parents. Creating opportunities for your teachers to learn from each other. This is the time where the word I should never be mentioned. These are our students. We all work together, and sharing students across teachers, being open to problems and problem solving. And the other big thing that can happen, which will be quite amazing, is this is one of the rare times you will see school leaders starting to talk to other school leaders and other schools about problems and issues and impact in the classrooms and with their teachers, as opposed to what often happens. We go out and talk about our brilliant teachers and our brilliant kids and our brilliant resources. Here's the time to really create a massive problem-based situation. So this is a time for school leaders to do what we all went into the business to do, to maximize the impact we can have on our teachers so that they can do their job.
Thank you. Chase, what advice do you have right now?
I think John's comments are so important, because when you're building a learning community of any kind under any circumstances, the behaviors that you want to see in students and the mindsets you want to see in students are those which are echoed by their teachers and are echoed by their administrators. We spent a lot of time today talking about how to keep students engaged, how to get students comfortable with making mistakes, how to make sure that students are there. I think the quickest route to that is making sure that those themes are echoed up the chain of their learning organization. We see this in particular with professional learning. So I'm on the professional learning team at NWEA. We've heard from a lot of partners that are either concerned about adding PL this year as one more thing, one more burden on teachers, or are really trying to focus on kind of just the basics, essential skills to really minimize the time impact. Those are really understandable reactions. I think they're a little bit misguided, because I think they take away one of the values that really keep teachers in the profession: the opportunity to grow, the opportunity to build skills, the opportunity to build a professional community. And so, in the spirit of John's comments, want to encourage leaders to be thinking about providing PL opportunities that help teachers continue to build that community, that help them grow their skills, not just in the tools and the platforms that they need to get through this period, but also the instructional strategies that are really going to help them feel like they're succeeding in this kind of environment. I think modeling that attitude and that openness with teachers is going to have an ongoing and long-term benefit for students. More important than students hitting, every one of their grades essential standards this year is helping them understand that they can persist and they can succeed even in the middle of a crisis like this.
Thank you so much. Doug, any advice?
Yeah. So the thing that's on my mind as Chase and John were talking is around teacher agency and teacher beliefs in their impact or efficacy. And so many teachers that I interact with, and Nancy and I are doing thousands of teachers a week on distance learning. We're meeting them all over the world. And the narrative is, by and large, I'm not good enough. And I think we need to show people the wins. They are having an impact and they can extend their impact. But if we show people the wins, 3 kids turned on their camera and they showed you their work. Last week, those 3 did not. That's you. 3 kids reflected back for you what they were learning today, and it was spot on. That's you. If we can help people see a relationship between what they're working on and what they value as an outcome, they start the narrative of, I'm being effective. And then we can address the areas like the 5 kids who didn't show up today and the things like that. But right now, the entire narrative is on the 5 kids who didn't show up, or the 3 kids who didn't turn in a paper, or whatever it is. And we're looking to way too long time frames for wins. Right now, what was good today? What was powerful today? And I'm not Pollyanna rose-colored glasses, but we need some wins for teachers now.
Thank you. And Nancy, could you add on?
I think leaders need to always be looking at cultivating 2 resources in particular. The first resource is cultivating that keen eye. In other words, and I'll build on what Doug had to offer as well as John too, knowing what those successes are, and then also considering how it is that we take those successes and we move them into regular practice, regardless of the platform. John, I know that you talk very often about changing the syntax of schooling, and that happens at the macro level, but that also happens at the micro level, right there on campus. So cultivating that keen eye, that's one resource that you have as a leader. And the second is cultivating the grace that you need to be able to grant yourself that grace to be patient with oneself in terms of leadership, to grant grace to teachers, to families, and also, again, to self and to school. Cultivating those 2 resources, a keen eye and grace, are going to carry us through, because we need you. We need you in the long term. We don't just need you for the short term to manage this emergency. We need you in the long term.
I agree with you. And
I
I
just
want to
follow up, Dominic, Doug's notion about the winds, smelling the roses. My plea is that when we've had previous crises kind of like this, earthquakes, floods, etc., unfortunately, when school resumes, everybody rushes back to the norm. And it's usually done on the basis of kids need to feel safe, well-being, etc. Let's go back to what it was. That would be the biggest travesty of COVID teaching of the lot, that we actually go back to the old grammar of schooling. I want every one of you to keep a learning log as you go through COVID teaching, hybrid, in class, at distance, about what actually are the wins, what is working, what really makes the difference, so that when we do come back, we can make sure that we have learned from this and schooling is better as a consequence of COVID, not worse.
Right. I appreciate that. I do. And again, as we say, celebrate the wins and celebrate the little wins right now. Also celebrate yourself. As a leader, you're here today. to get information, to make it stronger, to go back and say, I'm here, I have resources, let me help you, and I'm going to be a part of this journey with you. Don't forget you are a part of this journey with your teachers, and be transparent with them every single day you can be. So as we've had so many great questions, we've been lucky enough that Courtney from NWEA has been helping keep dialogue there, and she's going to read off some of the questions that we've gathered today for our panelists to answer during our question and answer format. So Courtney, welcome and thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. So we had a question from Jonathan Judy. Is there any information emerging about the impact of switching modes or formats of learning, meaning moving between remote and in-person learning, on student outcomes? Have we seen any disruptions in modes and change in student rates of learning?
Well, I can certainly answer that from the studies we've been doing here in Australia after 8 months. Overall, the learning has been much more positive, and there has been much higher effects on kids, except in writing. And that's primarily because teachers, as we've said in this session, have gone back to kind of like a first year. They're much more open to learning. They're much more listening to their students and triage. So overall, it's the overall message is that this has been positive. And you've got to attribute that to the success of teachers and that incredible workload and hard work they've done to make sure that their kids are not in any way disadvantaged. And so I would hope that you see this as an opportunity to do better and see this as a really positive opportunity.
And John started this the very first moments he talked. Keep track of what's working now, so we don't go back to some really old ways of doing business.
Thank you both. There was a question about what kinds of assessment. Yesterday, David Berliner spoke about assessing what's worth learning. Are we just talking about discrete skills or bigger ideas?
Well, we do have to assess what we taught. I mean, that's part of our job, is to say, here's what I was supposed to teach. Did they actually learn it? Did I impact their learning? So I would assume that societies have negotiated learning expectations, whatever they're called. What are we in pursuit of learning, and did we actually learn it? And I think that the idea of assessment has to change from these lock and key, I am giving you a test where I can proctor it and stand over you, to ways of students monitoring, students self-assessing, and then the teacher validating and not validating, and then students learning how to teach back to other people, so we can see what's stuck in the instruction and where we need to grow. I'm not saying we limit ours to basic skills. The standards are more robust than that. But we should also be assessing, their ability to think, their ability to form an argument, their ability to recognize information sources. I mean, there's lots of things that we can assess. And simply having students retell information to Flipgrid has been a powerful way to get a sense, because you can tell when their parents are coaching them what to say, and when a student is really telling you in a retell what they've learned. So there's very simple ways to invite students into, help me think about what you understand. Help me think about what you still need to learn.
Thank you so much. Another question that came in is, what kind of schedule would you recommend for elementary schools if we have to go back to fully virtual?
Huh. Well, I want to make one more comment on what John was saying about this. So far, we're seeing neutral or positive effects, and people don't like that narrative. But when we keep interrupting school, what we do here is disappointment. And so we got back physically, we were there for 3 weeks, and then they closed our school again. And then when we see that happen, and this is more anecdotal, not studied, when we see this happen, what we hear reported is a falling off of student participation for a while, and it takes some heroic efforts of the teachers to get kids back in, because they were physically back at school and then they're out again. So I think we should be careful about how many rapid switches we make with students in school. Our local district yesterday announced that we are remote distance learning until at least January 25 in middle school and high school. to give teachers time to plan. We're not going to interrupt the schedule over and over again. The question about elementary schedules, how many minutes do you need for them to learn? What can you do synchronously? What can you do asynchronously? Do some kids need more time? Some kids need less time. The rule here negotiated is 3 hours of synchronous, 2 hours of asynchronous. There's no evidence for that. That's how we negotiated it. So I don't think I can answer how many minutes of a schedule work in distance learning.
Thank you so much,
I
John.
think
Oh, I'm sorry.
the
Go ahead,
only thing
Chase.
I would emphasize there is, just because learning is asynchronous doesn't mean that it necessarily precludes the opportunity for students to interact with each other asynchronously or for teachers to interact with students, right? If you can think in terms of activities that function asynchronously, but still allow that opportunity for students to teach to each other, students to evaluate progress in groups, students to think collectively about solving problems, then I think you can achieve some of the same instructional objectives that you would put into a synchronous block into that asynchronous work. So I think it's maybe even a little bit less about how you structure those individual segments of time as, do I have options for ways to get at this in a rich way, whether synchronous or asynchronous?
Just a suggestion, hybrid teaching where you're teaching in class and online, that's a huge ask. And many schools here have solved that problem by having teachers on a roster coming into in class, but mixing the kids up by grade. And they do sometimes the same work as the kids are doing it online. They just happen to be physically in class. And we do have to attend to the teacher workload here. So I don't think the notion of having teachers do online and in synchronous and in class all together is a reasonable request on teachers. So think about school leaders about how you might want to do rostering of some teachers to come in, and then you can start to think about how you might want to share your students more effectively.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, John. Another question we had that came in is, what is the appropriate method to cover standards during COVID-19?
What is the appropriate method?
That's a big question. That's a really huge question. One of the things that I immediately thought of in hearing that question was covering versus uncovering. Covering can suggest, unfortunately, at times for teachers that can send this incorrect message that it's all about telling students, I've got to work through all of these things, as opposed to uncovering, as opposed to really emphasizing that ability for students to be able to reflect, to be able to self-assess, to utilize their metacognition and their self-regulation skills as well. Beyond that, I know that lots of organizations have engaged in identifying what are those priority standards or those priority expectations that we can utilize in order to be able to better leverage the learning that's happening. Simply saying to teachers, hey, we know that there's all of this other stuff going on, but we're just going to go about business as usual, is probably not a reasonable expectation. So let's thoughtfully figure out what are those priority places where we can really leverage and use that as a springboard to be able to engage in learning. I'm intrigued by what John had to say earlier about that what they're seeing is that reading and math scores seem to be holding their own, but that there's been a dip in the writing. So that signals to me we need to figure out how it is that we accomplish more writing in a distance learning environment.
Nancy, when you talked about the groups that have identified these standards, whatever they're calling them, what if when we teach those standards really, really well this year, from blended, remote, simultaneous, hybrid, high flex learning, what if the kids really learn it really well and we say to ourselves, maybe we didn't need all the rest of those standards because we have piles of standards and maybe we have too many of them and we should do a few of them really well. And this is the opportunity to narrow down our standards to some things that are developmentally appropriate for young people that have to be learned now.
Well, maybe you
if
could
you're
do what
into
they did here.
metaphors. Sorry, John, go ahead.
maybe they could do what they did here in Australia. The government said, we're going to take a year moratorium. No state testing, no national testing. Wow, what a relief. Fight for it, guys.
I think we have time for one final question. Or do you want to respond, Chase? I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, I was just going to say, I think if you're really into metaphors, one way to think about standards is a map, right? The map to how to get from where students are to the destination of mastery that we hope for all kids. To Doug's point, you don't usually take every road on the map to get from here to there. And to the point we've raised earlier, right? Assessments are really critical to understanding where students are on that map. So you make sure that you're not circling back on routes that they've taken before. But I think one of the opportunities we have in this moment is to really look very closely at those standards and understand not just what the traditional path is through them, but what some of the shortcuts are. Some of the ways that we can make sure that we're hitting those skills that not just that students need or that we consider essential, but that are the building blocks to higher levels of mastery, higher levels of proficiency.
Awesome. Well, I have one question that I'm going to kind of try and consolidate into a succinct question around equity during these times and providing intervention and special education services virtually, as well as, families in the lower social economical challenged communities and how you support those students when there's just a lack of engagement overall.
Certainly, we need to be careful here because those students, many of them will actually do better on online. They won't have the same distractions in the class. Many of the students on the autism spectrum are actually doing much better in the home learning. So let's be careful with the word equity here. The kids that are the biggest losers on online are the ones that are most dependent on you, right across the distribution of achievement. And so my concern is that equity is not about putting kids in classifications and saying, therefore, we need to treat them separately. Equity is the kids that are not getting the benefits of our excellent teaching. And so being attentive to that and therefore diagnose. Always work out to see which kids are the winners, which are the losers on the different kinds of teaching. And in many cases, we need to be incredibly surprised.
For me, on the state test issue, I would love not to have the state test in California this year. It's more convenient for me, gives me more time, less of a logistics nightmare, but actually I'm not afraid of it. You know what, if they give us the state test, great. Because we all know we're working really hard to get kids to learn. And so what are we gonna do with the results in a country that's basically closed down and populating our hospitals? So I wish there was not a state test this year. I think that's a wise decision for money, time, etc. But actually, I am not that worried because if we say this is the standards, this is what we were told. California does have a group that's narrowing down the standards. And if this is what we're told to do, then the assessments should match what we were asked to do. So
in terms of equitably supporting all kids, I think about, if you've ever watched the Tour de France, I think about drafting in bicycle racing, right? And a team in bicycle racing, somebody's at the front, somebody's at the back, somebody's in the middle, and they trade off spots over time in order to pull the whole team forward. I think as we approach individual kids and individual standards, we have to think it in the same way. In every particular content area, some students are going to be ahead some of the time and behind others, but working together in that line is how we pull an entire class of kids forward.
I appreciate you as the expert. That was a phenomenal conversation. I'm hoping that everyone that was with us, thank you for participating with us. If you liked what you heard and you were trying to dive a little bit deeper, there is the series books for distance learning. Please take a look at where you're trying to find. Is it the playbook? Is it for the parents? Is it higher ed? Is it school leaders? Or is it assessment? Each one of these books will deliver exactly what you're looking for and maybe dive deeper into some of the questions you had today. Also, if you are looking for more institutes or you had a great time and you wanted to send a friend, here are some of the upcoming events that you'll be able to participate in, and we hope to see you again to dive deeper into conversations around distance learning, because no matter what, we are going to have some type of this throughout our near future. So we hope you had a good time. As of now, that brings us to the end of our time today. As a reminder, You'll receive an email with a link to the on-demand recording and the PDF of the presentation slides. On behalf of myself, Corwin, and NWEA, thank you for joining us today and for all of your great questions. If you have additional questions or need any support, we're here to help. Thank you all, be safe, and have a great rest of your day. And thank you one last time to our experts. That was fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you much.
Thank you.